The Young and the Restless Spoilers. Jack Abbott did not arrange the meeting with Victor Newman out of nostalgia, nor out of any naive belief that old rivalries could be softened by time. He did it because the ground beneath Genoa City had shifted, because the war had moved into a realm neither of them could afford to lose control of, and because Matt Clark had become something far more dangerous than a personal enemy. The meeting was set with surgical precision, stripped of witnesses, stripped of spectacle, taking place in a space where neither man could claim symbolic dominance. From the moment Victor arrived, the air was thick with unspoken history, decades of betrayals, corporate bloodshed, and personal losses that had hardened into mutual contempt. Jack did not waste time with pleasantries. He understood that Victor respected only strength and clarity, not sentiment. He laid out the reality as he saw it. Jabot was under sustained assault, not through boardroom votes or hostile takeovers, but through invisible, relentless AI incursions designed to destabilize systems, manipulate projections, and slowly erode trust from within. Jack made it clear that this was not a misunderstanding or a coincidence. It was Victor's hand, even if it was hidden behind layers of deniability. Jack's proposal was blunt and deliberately framed as an ultimatum rather than a plea. Victor would cease all AI-based attacks against Jabot immediately and permanently. He would return the stolen AI program in full, without modifications, backdoors, or silent contingencies. In exchange, Jack would deliver Matt Clark directly into Victor's control. Not to the authorities, not to the press, not to any public reckoning that could spiral beyond containment, but to Victor himself. Jack did not downplay the magnitude of what he was offering. Matt Clark, he explained, was no longer merely a rogue operator or an opportunistic manipulator. He was a destabilizing force, unpredictable, embittered, and increasingly reckless. Matt thrived on chaos, on pitting powerful people against one another, on forcing them to make impossible choices while he remained safely in the shadows. Jack emphasized that Matt's obsession with dismantling legacy, particularly the Newman legacy, had crossed into dangerous territory. This was not about revenge anymore. This was about destruction for its own sake. As Jack spoke, Victor listened in silence, his expression unreadable, his mind moving several steps ahead of the words being spoken. He despised Jack Abbott with a depth that had been earned over a lifetime of conflict. Every instinct told him that no offer from Jack came without a hidden blade. And yet, Victor was not blind to patterns, nor was he immune to truth when it was presented with sufficient weight. Matt Clark had been circling the Newman family for too long, inserting himself into moments of vulnerability, exploiting emotional fractures, and leaving behind consequences that could not easily be traced back to him. Victor had already sensed that Matt was becoming a liability that could not be managed through intimidation or distance. The danger lay not just in what Matt had done, but in what he might still do if left unchecked. Jack's insistence that this was the only window to neutralize Matt without igniting a public firestorm struck a nerve Victor could not ignore. Still, Victor did not concede easily. He challenged Jack's narrative, questioning his motives, accusing him of using Matt as leverage to claw back control in a war Jabot was already losing. Jack met the accusation without flinching. He acknowledged the power imbalance, acknowledged that Victor's reach in the arena was formidable, but he refused to frame the proposal as weakness. Instead, he framed it as containment. If Victor continued the AI assault, Jabot would bleed slowly but publicly, and Victor would eventually be forced to escalate further to finish the job. That escalation, Jack warned, would attract scrutiny neither of them wanted: regulators, governments, external tech watchdogs who would not distinguish between aggressor and victim once the curtain was pulled back. Matt Clark, in that scenario, would become uncontrollable, exploiting the chaos to carve out his own influence, possibly turning evidence against both of them if it served his survival. The negotiation that followed was not loud or theatrical. It unfolded in carefully measured sentences, pauses heavy with calculation. Victor demanded guarantees, proof that Jack could deliver Matt without interference, without leaks, without collateral damage. Jack responded by outlining the surveillance, The psychological pressure points, the ways Matt's own arrogance had become his weakness. He made it clear that Matt believed himself untouchable, protected by the belief that neither Abbott nor Newman would risk exposing themselves to eliminate him. That belief, Jack explained, was precisely why this plan would work. Matt would never see it coming. Victor, in turn, insisted on terms that would protect Newman Enterprises beyond the immediate cessation of attacks. He wanted assurances that Jabot would not exploit the returned AI to launch counterstrikes, that this truce would not simply reset the battlefield under a different guise. What neither man said aloud was perhaps the most important truth of the night. They both understood that Matt Clark represented a threat not just to their companies, but to the carefully constructed myths they had built around themselves. Victor's empire was rooted in control, in the illusion that nothing happened without his consent. Matt threatened that illusion by operating outside Victor's influence, by refusing to be owned or intimidated. Jack's legacy, meanwhile, rested on resilience and reinvention, on the idea that Abbott Enterprises survived because it adapted. Matt undermined that narrative by turning Jack's adaptability into vulnerability, forcing him into reactive positions that chipped away at his authority. Eliminating Matt was not merely strategic. It was existential. When the unspoken alliance finally took shape, it did so without handshakes or declarations. It was sealed through mutual recognition of risk. Victor agreed to suspend the AI tax and return the stolen program under strict conditions, retaining the right to verify its integrity. Jack agreed to deliver Matt Clark within a narrow time frame, accepting full responsibility for any fallout if the operation failed. Both men understood that this was not peace. It was a ceasefire born of necessity, fragile and temporary, shadowed by the certainty that once Matt was removed from the equation, their war would resume in some other form. Yet for the moment, they stood alligned as friends, not as partners, but as enemies who recognized that survival sometimes required cooperation with the very person you trusted least. As they parted, neither allowed himself the illusion that this alliance would last. Victor remained wary, already considering contingencies should Jack attempt to manipulate the outcome. Jack, for his part, was under no delusion that Victor would hesitate to strike if an advantage presented itself. But beneath the layers of suspicion lay a shared understanding. Matt Clark had pushed them both to a threshold where pride had to yield to pragmatism. The agreement they forged was dangerous precisely because it worked. Because it offered a solution that satisfied immediate needs while planting the seeds of future conflict. In Genoa City, such arrangements rarely ended cleanly. They simply shifted the balance of power, buying time before the next reckoning. Matt Clark woke to the kind of silence that did not belong in a prison, but in a museum, or a gallery, or a shrine to generations of curated taste. The faint scent of polished wood and old money lingered underneath the chemical bite of whatever sedative they had used on him. For a few seconds, his mind floated between fog and clarity, cataloging sensations with the detached curiosity of someone who had trained himself to exploit vulnerability, even his own. His wrists ached where restraints had been, his muscles burned with the residue of immobility, and his head throbbed in a slow, measured rhythm that told him he had been under for hours, not minutes. The room was too quiet, too composed, for a man of Jack Abbott's temperament to have designed it as a permanent cell. Matt recognized it for what it was, a stopgap, an improvisation, a secret cage hidden in the shell of an expensive home that had never been built for shadows. That meant something important. It meant they were rushing. It meant the plan involving him was not yet complete. It meant there was still room for him to disrupt it. He sat up slowly, breathing through the wave of dizziness that followed, and began to scan his surroundings. The door had a lock that looked stronger than the hinges, which were older and slightly misaligned. There were no visible cameras inside, likely to reduce any trace of what was being done here, but faint electronic hums beyond the wall told him the hall outside was wired. The Abbotts wanted to pretend this did not exist, even inside their own home, and that denial was the crack he needed. He pressed his ear to the door and waited, counting the intervals between sounds, cataloging movement the way other people took in art. Footsteps passed at irregular spans, suggesting that whoever had been tasked with watching him was not a trained guard but a nervous family member or repurposed staff member trying to act like security. He heard the distant clink of glassware, the soft murmur of domestic life bleeding in from somewhere above, and the muted ringing of a phone that was quickly silenced. It was a house still trying to behave like a home, even while hiding a man like him in its depths. That contradiction amused him. He tested the handle slowly, feeling for give, then eased his weight against the weakest point of the doorframe. The latch gave a fractional shift, almost imperceptible, but enough to confirm what he suspected. The lock had been installed quickly, and more for show than endurance. He retreated, scanned the small room for anything that could be used as leverage, and his eyes landed on the narrow metal brace of the bed frame. A few minutes of controlled force, a few muttered curses swallowed back into silence, and he had bent the brace enough to wedge it between the door and frame. The sound it made as he pried the wood apart was minimal, masked by the hum of hidden systems and the air conditioning. When the door finally popped loose, it did so with a muted sigh rather than an incriminating crack. Matt slipped into the hallway like an old ghost reclaiming a body. The corridor outside bore all the hallmarks of Abbott taste, framed photographs showing generations smiling as if nothing truly bad had ever happened to them, soft lighting that flattered the decor. The kind of understated elegance that made guests feel both impressed and slightly inferior. To Matt, it was a map of blind spots. He registered the angles of the security cameras mounted near the ceiling, the stretches of wall where their fields of view did not quite overlap, and the seams in the paneling that indicated hidden doors or service access. He moved along the edges of those blind zones, steps light, posture controlled, refusing to rush even as adrenaline whispered that his window was narrow. He knew from the way the house was laid out that he was in a lower wing, likely repurposed from storage or guest accommodations. If he could reach a side entrance or a service exit, he could vanish into the grounds, and from there into the city. He imagined the look on Jack's face when he realized his carefully constructed leverage had sprouted legs and walked away, taking the secret of their little arrangement with Victor Newman and turning it into a weapon. Matt did not just want to escape. He wanted to flip the story, to make the Abbotts regret ever thinking they could cage him, to make Victor question why Jack had thought he could bargain with something this volatile. Every step he took down that hallway was not just a move toward freedom. It was a step toward flipping the whole arrangement on its head. Upstairs, Diane Jenkins had not slept easily since Jack had agreed to house Matt Clark under their roof. The idea of that man breathing the same air as her family made her skin crawl in a way that no corporate rival or scheming ex ever had. She had lived through enough manipulation, enough near misses, enough consequences she still woke up sweating from to recognize the particular flavor of danger Matt exuded. It was not just his crimes or his history that unnerved her. It was the way he enjoyed inserting himself into the cracks of other people's lives, the way he sensed insecurities and regrets and widened them until they were fractures. She had argued with Jack about it, had warned him that keeping Matt in the mansion was not just a logistical risk, but a psychological one. Jack, driven by strategy and the need to seize any advantage over Victor, had insisted this was temporary, necessary, controlled. But Diane had long ago learned that control was an illusion when fear and resentment were given a live body to inhabit. Unable to silence her instincts, she had taken to quietly monitoring the discreet security feeds Jack had installed around Matt's makeshift cell, forcing herself to learn the rhythms of the cameras. The pattern of the guard rotations, the layout of the signals that told them when doors were open or closed. That was why, when a subtle flicker crossed one of the monitors, simply a half-second of static, barely enough to notice Cedian's entire body went on alert. She frowned, leaned closer, and replayed the last few moments on the feed. The camera outside Matt's door had captured a faint movement, a shadow in a place where there should have been none, followed by a microsecond misalignment of the picture. To most eyes, it would have looked like an ordinary glitch. To hers, it looked like the house protesting that something was out of place. Her heart rate jumped, but she did not call out immediately. Calling for help meant admitting, even implicitly, that she believed Matt was in motion and she knew Jack would hear accusation in that. Instead, she rose from her chair, moving with purpose, the dread in her stomach solidifying into something sharper. She descended the stairs toward the lower level, each step a memory of warnings unheeded, of compromises agreed to for the supposed greater good. The farther she went, the quieter the house became, as if it, too, were waiting to see whether the choice they had made would come back to devour them. When Diane turned the corner into the hallway leading to Matt's cell, the sight that greeted her confirmed every fear she had tried to push down. The door stood slightly ajar, its frame warped in a way that spoke of calculated pressure rather than accidental damage. The inside light bled into the corridor, empty and accusing. Her breath caught in her throat for a second, but she did not indulge the panic. She moved forward, senses flaring, and caught the faintest whisper of movement further down the hall, near a side passage that led toward a service staircase rarely used by anyone but staff. Without thinking, she called out his name in a low, steady voice, not to reason with him, but to disrupt his rhythm, to let him know he was not invisible. Matt turned, his eyes catching the light with the predatory sharpness of someone who had been waiting his entire life for an opening like this. The tension that snapped into the air between them was not just about physical threat. It was about history, about grudges, about the way people like Matt never forgot those who had previously been obstacles to their schemes. For a moment they simply stood there, assessing each other, each calculating how far the other was willing to go. Diane knew she could not let him reach that stairwell. If he did, the geometry of the house would tilt in his favor. More exits, more shadows, more space between him and the truth that they were holding him here. She stepped into his path, body angled to block the narrow stretch of corridor, and tried to use her voice as a tool, not a plea. She told him this was over, that he was not going anywhere, that no matter what he thought he had figured out, the Abbotts still controlled the board. Matt's reaction was a flash of contempt and satisfaction, an almost casual cruelty that confirmed he had already calculated how vulnerable their position truly was. When she made a move to reach for the small panic button on the wall, only of the safety measures Jack had insisted be installed, lunged forward with the suddenness of a man who had spent his life turning seconds into weapons. The impact sent her back against the wall, pain blossoming along her shoulder as his hand closed around her wrist, preventing her from hitting the alarm. The struggle that followed was messy and elegant, the kind of fight that had nothing to do with skill and everything to do with desperation. Diane clawed, twisted, used every ounce of strength to keep his momentum from carrying him past her. Matt fought with a brutal efficiency born of too many cheap motels and back alley confrontations, but the sedatives still lingering in his system dulled his edge, slowed his reflexes by just enough that she could keep him from fully overpowering her. Furniture rattled in nearby rooms as their bodies collided with the walls, a picture frame crashing to the floor and shattering. The sound ricocheted through the hallway, an alarm more visceral than any electronic signal. Diane tasted blood where she had bitten her lip but refused to let go, fingers digging into Matt's arm, nails leaving marks that would bloom into bruises if he survived long enough for them to appear. In his eyes she saw not just violence, but delight in knowing that even in this moment, he had leverage. He hissed, not loud enough for the whole house to hear, but close enough for her to feel it, that he knew what Jack was doing, that he understood he was being traded like contraband between enemies, that he would make sure everyone knew how low the Abbotts had stooped. Upstairs, Carl Abbott had been pacing, caught between anger at his father's willingness to drag their home into a war with Victor and a grim determination to do whatever was necessary to protect the family now that the decision had been made. He was not blind to the moral ugliness of keeping Matt Clark here, but he had lived through enough betrayal and upheaval to know that pretending they were too good for such compromises would not save anyone. The sound of something shattering below snapped him from his thoughts. It was not the polite clink of a glass accidentally knocked from a table. It was the violent, splintering crash of something breaking under force. He stilled, listening, and then heard the muffled impact of bodies hitting walls, the unmistakable thrum of chaos erupting in a place that had been carefully engineered to project order. Without hesitating, he lunged toward the stairs, his mind already conjuring images of Matt loose in the house, of his mother cornered, of Jack's entire plan dissolving in a burst of panicked violence. When Kyle reached the hallway, the scene confirmed his worst scenario was already in progress. Diane was pinned partially against the wall, one arm twisted painfully as she struggled against Matt's superior size and leverage. Her eyes flashed with a mix of fear and defiance, and there was a smear of blood at the corner of her mouth that made something primal ignite in Kyle's chest. Matt, despite the sedation in his system, still radiated dangerous energy, his movements controlled enough to be effective but raw enough to show he was fighting through residual weakness. Kyle did not waste time shouting or threatening. He hurled himself forward, grabbing Matt by the shoulder and yanking him back, using momentum rather than brute strength to tear him away from Diane. The shift in weight sent all three of them staggering, another picture frame crashing to the floor, glass skittering underfoot. For a moment it was a tangle of limbs, curses ground out through clenched teeth, the air thick with the sound of labored breathing and the metallic tang of fear. Matt adjusted quickly, targeting Kyle now, recognizing him as both an obstacle and an opportunity. He spat out that none of this would hold, that the whole world would eventually know what the Abbotts had done, that he had enough information to burn both Jebo and Newman Enterprises to the ground if he played it right. He invoked Victor's name with a kind of twisted pleasure, painting a picture of how he would twist the truth so that Jack appeared not as a pragmatic strategist, but as a man reckless enough to kidnap and bargain with a known threat on neutral ground. Diane, regaining her footing, heard every word, and the implications coiled in her gut like wire. If Matt escaped and reached Victor first with his version of events, the alliance Jack had brokered could implode, or worse, reverse into a trap of Victor's making. The man they had hoped to neutralize would become a wedge between them and one of the most powerful forces in their world. Kyle felt the same realization crash over him, but he channeled it into fury, into determination. Matt's words might be true, but they would only matter if he lived long enough and stayed free long enough to tell them. The commotion drew Jack at last, pulled from his own storm of calculations by the undeniable fact that the crisis he had tried to contain in theory had burst into the physical space of his home. As he descended the stairs, every step felt like a tally of his misjudgments. He had convinced himself he could manage this, that he could hold a man like Matt Clark in the shadows of Abbott Manor until the moment came to hand him off to Victor Newman like a piece in a game only he fully understood. But the sounds rising from the lower level impact, strain, the ragged breathing of people pushed past their limits made it clear that he had been arrogant, that he had underestimated Matt's capacity for disruption and overestimated the integrity of the boundaries he thought he had erected. When he rounded the corner and took in the scene again with her clothes disheveled and eyes blazing, Kyle bracing himself against Matt's weight. Matt himself still fighting with insane persistence despite being outnumbered, Jack felt a complicated surge of emotions he did not have the luxury to untangle. Guilt, certainly. Fear, not just for the immediate danger, but for what this meant for the delicate balance of his wider plan. And beneath all of it, anger, the kind that sharpened rather than blinded. He moved in without hesitation, grabbing Matt from behind and using the element of surprise to shift the balance. Together, he and Kyle managed to force Matt down to his knees, Diane darting forward to finally slam her hand against the panic button embedded in the wall. A subtle alarm activated throughout the house, not a blaring siren, but a low, insistent tone that summoned the security team Jack had kept on a short leash, wanting to limit how many people knew about the presence of their unwilling guest. As Matt struggled, he twisted his head enough to meet Jack's eyes, and what Jack saw there chilled him more than any physical threat. There was clarity in Matt's gaze, the clarity of a man who knew he might lose this particular battle but had already planted seeds elsewhere. He hissed, low enough that only those close could hear, that Jack had miscalculated if he thought Victor would simply accept a neat trade. He claimed he had already left contingencies, pieces of information and hints placed carefully where they would eventually be found. Enough to raise questions about who had really been pulling the strings behind these recent escalations. The security personnel arrived then, moving with a mix of professionalism and confusion, clearly unprepared for the sight of their employer kneeling on the floor, physically restraining a man whose presence in the house they had not fully understood. Jack barked orders with the authority of someone who could not afford questions, directing them to secure Matt with proper restraints, to move him to a more fortified location deeper within the estate, to sweep the immediate area for any devices or tools he might have used to tamper with the door. They obeyed, but Diane could see the flicker of doubt in some of their eyes. It was subtle, but it was their crack in the family's carefully maintained image of moral superiority. Matt, even as they dragged him back toward confinement, kept talking, not in panicked bursts, but in measured, poisonous statements about secrets, about deals with devils, about how easily reputations could shatter when the public realized how far men like Jack would go to protect what was theirs. When the door slammed shut again behind Matt's newly reinforced prison, the silence that followed was heavier than before, dense with the echo of things that could not be unsaid. Diane cradled her bruised wrist, feeling the tremor in her muscles now that the immediate threat had passed. Kyle paced a short, tight distance, energy still coiled in him like a spring, his jaw clenched so tightly it looked painful. Jack stood with his back to them for a moment, staring at the closed door as if he could will it to become something less damning. In that narrow hallway, the three of them were no longer simply a family arguing over strategy. They were accomplices in something that could not easily be framed as justified, even to themselves. Diane broke the silence first, pointing out in a low, strained voice that Matt had not just tried to escape. He had made it clear he understood Jack's arrangement with Victor, that he knew enough to weaponize it. Kyle added that if Matt had overheard even fragments of conversations, he could stitch together a narrative that made it look like the Abbotts were not victims of Victor's aggression, but co-conspirators in a scheme that would horrify shareholders and family allies alike. Jack listened, absorbing their words, his mind already running scenarios. If Matt had truly set contingencies, then simply keeping him locked up here was no longer enough. Any plan involving trading him to Victor now carried additional risk. It was not just about whether Victor would accept the deal, but how Victor might spin it, how he could hold it over Jack in the future. Victor thrived on leverage, on knowledge that could be turned into long-term control. If he discovered that Jack had held Matt in a secret cell inside his own home, using him as a bargaining chip while the war raged on, Victor might agree to the trade. But he would never let Jack forget what it cost him. Worse, if word ever leaked beyond that tight circle, the Abbotts' claim to any moral high ground in their feud with the Newmans would evaporate. Jabot would not just be the company that had been attacked. It would be the company that had responded by descending into the same morally murky territory as its rival. In the private family meeting that followed, held behind a locked door in one of the mansion's study rooms, the atmosphere was less like a domestic gathering and more like a crisis summit. Jack explained in clipped, exhausted sentences that their original strategy had depended on Matt being a problem they could quietly resolve. An unambiguous threat they could deliver to Victor in exchange for a concrete concession. But the escape attempt and the threats Matt had made changed the nature of that threat. Diane pressed him, her voice edged with rightful anger, asking whether he had considered from the beginning that a man like Matt would never go quietly, that he would pry at every seam in their defenses until something tore. Kyle, standing near the window, stared out at the manicured grounds and thought about how little the view prepared anyone for what was festering beneath the surface. He suggested they needed to tighten security even further, not just physically, but informationally, people knowing the full extent of what was happening, more compartmentalization, more control over narratives if anything leaked. They talked about reinforcing the area around Matt's cell with additional surveillance, about rotating security personnel to avoid pattern recognition, about installing redundancies on locks and alarms. But beneath those logistical discussions ran a deeper current of unease. Every measure they added was a reminder that they were not simply protecting themselves from an external invader. They were holding a man captive in their home, helping to use him as a tool in a larger game. Jack could feel the weight of that contradiction pressing against his chest. He had always told himself that his fights with Victor were rooted in principle, that he pushed back not just out of ego, but out of a genuine belief that the Newmans' methods were corrosive. Yet here he was, orchestrating something that looked uncomfortably similar to the kind of ruthless calculus Victor was famous for. Matt had attacked them, had endangered their livelihoods, had manipulated systems and people with no regard for collateral damage. In Jack's mind, that justified extraordinary measures. But the image of Diane slammed against the wall, of Kyle wrenching Matt back with raw panic in his eyes, kept replaying in a loop that made all his justifications sound more hollow each time. As the discussion wound down, the Abbotts reached a brittle consensus. They would increase security around Matt to a level where another escape attempt would be nearly impossible. They would review every word spoken within range of his hearing so far, trying to calculate how much he truly knew versus how much he guessed. Jack would revisit the terms of his arrangement with Victor, considering whether it needed to be accelerated, altered, or perhaps even abandoned if the risk to their own reputation grew too high. Diane insisted on having a more direct role in monitoring the situation, and willing to again be the one who saw danger coming, was sidelined in the planning. Kyle, restless and unresolved, volunteered to be on call at all times when he was in the house, unwilling to leave his mother or father exposed to another confrontation alone. They told themselves these steps would be enough, that they were simply doing what any family in their position would do when backed into a corner by a man like Matt Clark. Yet when the meeting ended and they each retreated to their separate corners of the house, the sense of safety they tried to rebuild felt thin and provisional. The walls of Abbott Manor, once symbols of refuge and legacy, now seemed to hold echoes of Matt's threats, of the promises of secrets yet to detonate. Somewhere below, in the reinforced cell that had once been an ordinary room, Matt lay awake, plotting not just his next move, but the shape of the story that would emerge if he ever broke through again. Above him, Jack stared at the darkened ceiling of his bedroom and wondered at what point a strategy stopped being defensive and became something darker. The AI attacks might pause, the trade with Victor might still happen, the family might hold the line. Or the night's chaos might prove to be only the first tremor, a warning that once certain lines were crossed, there was no way to return to the clean narratives of victim and aggressor they had clung to before. For now, the house was quiet again. But it was the kind of quiet that felt less like peace and more like the breath held between one shock and the next.